So, Paul, can you walk us through the details, as of right now, of this deal that's being reported?
Yeah, well, basically, it's a 1-for-3 deal. For every one Israeli hostage freed, Israel will, in turn, release 3 Palestinian prisoners currently held by Israel. The deal calls for 50 Israeli hostages to be released, all of them women and children. That means 150 Palestinian prisoners in Israel will be freed as well. It's a swap. Under Israeli law, aspects of the deal can be challenged in court, so there's a 24-hour pause on any of it getting started. That means it'll likely all begin Thursday. But even then, the releases will be spread over 3 or 4 days, with small groups of hostages released each day. The other big news is that all of it comes with a 4-day pause in the fighting, a truce to allow all of this to happen. And there's a promise from Hamas that Red Cross workers will be allowed into Gaza to check up on the rest of the hostages who, for now, are being left behind. And finally, there's an agreement from Israel to allow 300 trucks of aid into Gaza per day henceforth. A lot of stuff in play here, Adrienne, but the headline, 50 of those Israeli hostages to be released beginning Thursday.
So, Paul, in a situation like this, it's always interesting to know how the deal came about. What do you know?
Yeah, well, we know that talks have been underway on this for weeks, but Benjamin Netanyahu today credited U.S. President Joe Biden with some last-minute tweaks to get the deal past the finish line. And Qatar is credited with playing a key role in getting Hamas on side. Tonight, there was a lengthy debate among Israeli cabinet ministers on it, but in the end, at the urging of Netanyahu, it passed, and with a strong majority.
And so then I guess now that it's passed, there's a 24-hour period, but what about the war itself? How does the deal affect the war?
Look, to be clear, as it stands, once the truce ends, the war continues. Just today, Netanyahu reiterated Israel's view that it is committed to the destruction of Hamas. And despite this deal, Hamas, likewise, is not wavering from its commitment to eliminate Israel. The headline tonight is the deal, Adrienne, but the reality is that the war itself remains far from over.
All right, Paul Hunter, thank you.
You're welcome.
So for more insight into this developing story, I'm grateful to be joined by Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Janice, what do you make of the fact that we're talking about a deal now? It's 45 days after these hostages were taken. To a degree, was it not always going to be about a prisoner release of some kind?
It sure was always going to be, but it was also going to be about absolutely degrading Hamas's military capability. Those were the two objectives for Israel, and it turned down a deal before it felt it had made sufficient progress.
So is that why it took so long?
That is why. The same deal was offered to Israel with minimal variations last week. They said no.
Beyond some of the hostages, women and children, what else does Israel get out of this?
Well, Israel does get those hostages back. Tremendous political pressure inside the country. Even the army understood they had no choice. And there is also a possibility that these talks could go on and they could get more hostages back.
Is there an inherent risk in a deal like this for either side?
There are really serious risks. The ceasefire is probably the riskiest part because there's no lines to deploy to. This is a fragile ceasefire, Adrienne.
What do you mean no lines to deploy to?
When you have a ceasefire, forces pull back to an agreed-on line. Israel's forces are surrounding Gaza City. There is no line to withdraw. One ambush, one violation, the ceasefire breaks down.
Yeah, I'm curious about, I know that you were at the Halifax Security Forum a few days ago talking to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. I know that you have connections in a number of circles of power around the world. There's so much conversation around the world right now about the number of casualties in Gaza. There is a lot of rage about what is happening. Is that message getting through to the circles of power in Israel?
They certainly understand the anger around the world, but they are not really focused on that, Adrienne. There is an iron determination. I've never seen anything quite like it, that Hamas will never be in the position to do this again.
Do you think that is a likelihood? I mean, how do you destroy an entity like Hamas and not create another one in the process?
Well, you have to destroy only their military capability, because you certainly cannot destroy the ideology and the movement. Is it achievable? It will be possible to weaken Hamas. What is surprising among the governments that were there over this weekend, there's a shared understanding that Hamas cannot come back as the government.
And in terms of what the next few days look like, I mean, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen long term, I think.
You're right.
But in terms of the next few days, what are you watching for?
There will be a small number of hostages released each day in order to keep the incentives going for the ceasefire. What am I watching for? The start of the next round of negotiation during this ceasefire to prolong it in exchange for an additional release.
So you're not anticipating a big group of hostages coming out at once?
No. It's going to be a staged release spread out over the 5 days to make sure that there is no incentives on Israel's part to violate the ceasefire. I'm hoping that, in fact, those negotiations will start during this pause for the next group of hostages to come out.
And for the men to come out? Because we're only talking about women and children as hostages and women and children as prisoners.
They're men who were civilians, not soldiers. That will be the next group. Some of them are older. That will be the next group. There is the possibility, if the hostage negotiators are good enough to seize the opportunity, that happens during this ceasefire.
And then I suppose eyes, too, on what happens elsewhere in the region. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen.
Yes, but it's unlikely that Hezbollah would disrupt during the ceasefire. So I think we've got this pause. The real question is, what do we make of it to broaden it and deepen it?
All right, Janice Stein, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Always
Thank you.
a pleasure to be with you.